So I'm Jack. This is actually my second year speaking with you all. Last year I was honored to have the opportunity to speak about HTMX use with Django during the virtual 2021 conference. So as you can see on the screen, I run a business called WaterVise, and I am all of these things at the bottom of the screen, but I'm not sure that I've mastered any of them. So we'll see. All right, so again, my talk is Home on the Range with Django, and we're going to talk about using Postgres range types with your Django applications and why you might want to consider doing so. So a few disclaimers. These topics are maybe a little more intermediate. Some of you more advanced folks will probably think this is old hat, but and this is also Postgres specific, so if you're using a different database backend, this really won't apply to you, but hopefully in a future project you'll consider Postgres. It's a pretty awesome database. So the goals here, hopefully we'll learn why ranges can be more useful than having distinct start and end or min and max fields in your project. You'll get familiar with some of the terminology. We'll see a number of approaches to using and querying with ranges, and I'll give you some resources that will help you as you move forward if you'd like to use ranges in your applications. So real life, ranges are used all around us all the time. It's just not something we generally think about a lot. Daily temperature highs and lows, things like the range of calories in a set of meals, or business hours for a set of businesses. So we use them all the time. It's something that is in most of our applications in one way or another. The history of range fields, they've been around since 2011, the range types in Postgres, and since 2015, Django has had support for these. When we look at projects, often we have, kind of like I mentioned, a start and a stop field. So a start date and an end date, or a minimum date and a maximum date. Querying with the start and stop values can get really complicated and challenging really quick. It's not always super intuitive, and we'll look at some of that here. So some comparisons, when we look at constraints, for instance, having two separate fields, the database doesn't know that they're related in any way. So unless you add specific constraints to say, hey, the min value needs to be lower than the max value, the database doesn't know that. So you have to build some logic where you end up with weird things like ranges from $200,000 to $140,000, which just doesn't make sense. And then when it comes to preventing overlaps, if you want to prevent overlaps in your database, you have to kind of trick the database into treating those two fields as a single field to do this effectively with a exclusion constraint. So probably not super easy to see, and you don't need to see the details really on this one, but this is everything that's required to add the functionality I just mentioned. We add a check constraint on here to prevent a lower value from being larger than the higher value, and an exclusion constraint to prevent some overlaps. At the top, you can see we have to add an additional TSTZ range function so that the database can, again, kind of get tricked into thinking that period start and period end, those two fields will be treated as a single field in the constraint. Comparatively, using a range field, we just have one field and we're storing a good amount of information in a single field. The lower value, the upper value, and some information about the boundaries of that range. The database knows that they're all related. By default, Postgres won't let you put a lower value in the upper value spot. So you can't have backwards ranges. So right off the bat, it comes with some benefits there that you don't have to manually do that for the database. So you can see we end up with a much smaller, the same equivalent portion of the model here. So some comparisons with queries. Again, you have to include both fields. So these are often unintuitive. I found it really challenging as a beginner to understand how to do this right, because you end up with things like this. In reality, the event start, so if we have an event model with an event start and an event end, and we want to look at how that, filter that down to the instances that it overlaps with in a 12-hour period, you have to do event start is less than the end of that period you're looking for, and event is greater than or equal to, the end is greater than or equal to the start of that period that you want. And that just, as a beginner, that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. When you kind of, I had to literally draw it out visually to understand that when I started out 4 or 5 years ago. So using a single intuitive lookup instead, you end up with this. If we have an event period, which is a date-time range field, then we just have to look at, does it overlap? It's as simple as that. There's no messing around with starts and ends and multiple lookups. Just very simple. Does it overlap? So to make sure we all understand what these different lookups mean, we're going to go back to elementary school, but there won't be any tests, I promise. A few things right off the bat. If you come from like a math background, or if you remember back in elementary school, you had the number line, and you have intervals, and they could be closed intervals, open intervals. So the terminology that Postgres uses may not be what you're familiar with, but these are kind of the equivalents. And then this is what it looks like, right? So on the very top, we have from the number 1 to 7, if this is looking at an integer range, we have from the number 1 to 7, but that's exclusive of both of those. So that range really includes the numbers 2 through 6. And I'm putting this up here. Again, this is not a test. This is just to make sure we all understand before we go on. That second one down is really the one we're going to kind of focus on, and that's what Postgres and Django use by default, is a inclusive and exclusive range. So when you look at this, this value, it includes the number 1, that second one down again. It includes the number 1, but it does not include the number 7. And that is the default that Postgres uses. Another way to look at it is just like this. Again, the second one down being that, in this case, 1 is less than or equal to x, and 3 is greater than x. So we are not including 3, it is excluded. Kind of boring stuff, but here we go into the visuals of it. So I put together several slides here. Again, I'm very much a visual person, and I know I'm not alone in that. So sometimes seeing how these different lookups that can be used when you're querying ranges, seeing it visually can help. So this one is the first. We're looking at when a range overlaps a range. And as you can see, the two on the bottom, the one where it's 0 inclusive, 2 exclusive, it's almost touching 2, but it's not touching 2. It doesn't include 2. So that one would get filtered out of this filter. Contains is another one. And the nice thing about contains is that it can be used with a single element or a range. So in this case, we're trying to filter and return any instances that contain the element of interest. So the number 4 there, the integer 4, is our what we want to filter on. So we're looking at anything that contains that, any of our instances that contain that. And the first two there, 0 to 8 and 4 to 9, do contain it. And again, 4 to 9, because that bottom number is inclusive, it includes that 4. Like I mentioned, you can also use contains with a range. So in this case, a range containing another range. And then contained by just reverses that relationship. So in this case, we're looking for anything that's within the range of 1 to 8, with 8 being excluded. And this also can be used with a range compared to a range. Adjacent to lets you identify things that are right next to the range you're interested in. So if your hours of operation are from 8 to 10, and you want to find out if there's anything immediately after that closing time, this is what you would use. So the range of interest here excludes the number 6, which is why those 2 on the outside that are green are the way they are. And then fully less than and fully greater than just really mean, is it all the way to the left of or all the way to the right of the range that we're looking at? So how do we actually use these? The PsychoPG2 Extras package provides some tools for translating between Django fields and the range types in Postgres. And there's a couple things to keep in mind here. So we've got numeric range and date range, and there's a couple on the next page. When it comes to integers and dates, those are discrete values. All of the other ones, and big int range, sorry, decimal ranges, and on this next page, date time range and date time TZ range, those are not discrete, they are continuous. So you can have continually smaller periods between things. And that can be important as we'll talk about later. So the date time range, unless you're using naive date times, you're probably never going to use that. I wouldn't recommend it. For most things, if you're using time zones, use the time zone TZ range from PsychoPG2 Extras. And as you can see here, this shows the equivalent Postgres and equivalent Django fields that these map to. So when we're defining range fields in a Django model, this is some examples here. So using integer range field, we can have it with no additional information. It's just an empty range. We can use a tuple for a default, or we can use a numeric range. Again, that numeric range is coming from the PsychoPG2 Extras package. And we can also specify the bounds we're using here. So again, I mentioned that Postgres by default uses a inclusive lower and exclusive upper, but you can specify these. It gets a little weird, and it's something I'm not going to go into depth here, because you kind of got to wrap your brain around when it's appropriate to do so. And then there's some lookups that Django provides that are based on the range bounds themselves. The most useful ones that I use all the time are the starts with and ends with. These let you query on the lower and upper portions of a range. So a few examples here of instance creation. Here we're defining 3 different ranges. So my first range is using a numeric range from that extras package. And we've defined the lower value as none, the upper value is none, and the bounds, I just kept it with the default inclusive, exclusive. The second range down there, we're just using a tuple, 1 and 5. And the third one, we're also using numeric range, but we have a lower value of 7 and an upper value of none. We create a few objects in my model using those, and then on this next page, you can see how we are using the starts with and ends with. So if we look at starts with, we can add on additional lookups like greater than, less than, greater than, equal to. In this case, we're looking for any of those three that is greater than 3 in that lower value. And obviously the last one fits that category. And then ends with ends with equals 5 there. The only one that matches with that is the second range. You can also create your own range types. Django and Postgres provide the functionality to do that. One example that you might be interested in, for instance, is taking the generic IP address field and extending it to be a range of IP addresses. So if you're doing work on a network and you need to record a number of ranges, this customer is operating from this IP address to this IP address. You can use the ranges to extend it to do that. And again, I'm not going into the detail with that because we are limited on time. But the Django docs do a pretty good job of getting you started on how to extend the ranges for your own types. When it comes to indexing, pretty much stick to the gist index or the B-tree index. Those are the two that really cover the majority of the lookups that we're interested in. Some of the other indexes like gin don't cover any of the range stuff. So the big thing that I'm hoping to bring to this talk is a project I've been developing. It's not super beautiful, but it's simple and hopefully will be useful to you all. So it's a pool scheduling application for a municipality. And the idea here is that we have a bunch of users and a bunch of pools. And each pool can have multiple lanes, multiple lockers, and maybe closed here and there. And then users can make reservations for these lanes and lockers. This is a little more detailed view of the schema for the database. And as you can see, I've tried to throw in several ranges here as much as possible. So we have a couple integer range fields that are the depth and business hours for the pool, the maximum number of swimmers that a lane can have. The reservations are from one time period to another, date time period, I should say. And let me pull it up. So this is still somewhat of a work in progress, but I have a number of examples in here already. Again, the goal here was really to help others that were in the same boat as me in the past. I tried to find documentation and details for how to use range fields. And as much as I love Django docs for just about everything, when it comes to range fields, if you're not familiar with them, it can be a real challenge to find useful stuff in the docs or even on like Stack Overflow. There's not a whole lot of examples out there. So in this case, I've tried for every page in this project, and you can go to the URL that I'll show you at the end, and it's just a Docker compose project. But for each one, we've got some details about what we're doing. So in this case, we're just listing the pools and the business hours. And for each time period here for our business hours, we're using .lower. So pool.businesshours.lower and pool.businesshours.upper to give the actual value here. And then we've zero padded it to make it pretty. Again, lots of examples here. So to show how the reservations that are greater than 8 hours in length, you can see here I've just got some example data that's been mocked into the database. We have four reservations for lanes that are over a period of 8 hours. And when we go to the code notes, again, it goes into some detail here, and I encourage you all to look at this later. But we're essentially using the ends with and starts with lookups that I mentioned earlier, and filtering to annotate each one of those with the start time subtracted from the end time. And then we add a filter after that to get the delta, any delta that is greater than a time delta, time zone time delta of 8 hours. For reservations this week, either starting on a Sunday with this first example or a Monday with the second example, we can see the results in this calendar here. This shows all for this week, so starting on the 16th and going towards the end, to the end of the week. There are all of our examples. And for this one, created just a simple utility in a separate file to pull the start and end date time for this week and next, and then filtering on that, similar to the other one, using the overlap this time. So as I mentioned before, overlap simplifies your queries when it comes to taking one date time range and another date time range and identifying if they overlap or not. This makes it very simple. Also shown here are examples for all the reservations this month, any past reservations, reservations year to date or from now till the end of the year. This application has just a simple check-in, check-out functionality. So for reservations, you can compare then if the reservation, if they've checked in for the reservation or checked out, or if they haven't, this will show you if there's an overdue start. So for instance here, these 3 reservations, they never checked in. And that is performed by looking at, again, the starts with, and then using less than now. And for the actual check-in date time range, starts with, and we look for something that's null. So they never checked in. One of the things that was really challenging as a beginner also was working with date times and other ranges when it came to forms. So I have 3 different examples here of ways you might approach using ranges in your forms. First being, first being manually rendering the values. So in this case, I manually put a input tag into the template. It's not actually using forms. This is using HTMX, so that when I select some date times here and apply, we're using HTMX to send a post request, which then the input, or I'm sorry, the response from that gets input into a div and displayed here. And as somebody who has come to really like HTMX, I think that might just be the easiest way. But it doesn't come with the validations that Django Forms does. So if we look at Django Forms, this example is very similar, but what we've done is use a text field, and then I'm cleaning in the back end. So it looks just about the same. When we apply, you get the results. But again, we've got the form with a char field in this case and a text input for the widget. And then we are cleaning that text to convert it into an actual value that we can use. So in this case, we've attached using jQuery. We've attached a date time range picker. Actually, all of these examples do. You could use obviously a different JavaScript library or different means of displaying that date time range, but that was convenient here. And then the last one is to use a true date time range field from Django. And in this case, it displays it as a split multi-widget with two different date time fields. And so again, I just attached using the same, I'm using Bootstrap date range picker here. You could use whatever you like, but we select a range, submit, and we get some results. We've got a number of other examples that are still in progress that will show some more advanced filtering and database work when it comes to using ranges. But hopefully this will be a good start to look at and beneficial to you all. There are some pitfalls when it comes to using ranges. Support in the Django admin is not really great, and there's actually a ticket open that kind of talks about that. The concern was that modifying Django admin to bring in contrib Postgres content to change it would be problematic and kind of mixing things that maybe shouldn't be mixed. You can, of course, extend the default multi-widget used in Django's admin with your own template, and then use a similar technique to what I was showing earlier, and attach a picker of some sort. But by default, you just get these text boxes, and it can be a little off-putting, I guess, trying to modify your ranges in the admin. Trying to use lower and upper as callables, they're not callables. So when it comes to querying, you can use the lower and upper database functions to specifically pull out those pieces of the range. And then when it comes to using lookups, again, you can use starts with and ends with to pick out those pieces. And using F with the extra classes, F is used within Django to refer to the contents of a field. But the PsychoPG2 extra classes are not Django classes, and they are not Postgres types. They are kind of that translation layer between the two. So you may have to use cast if you're trying to pick out, for instance, to conduct aggregation or annotation, and you would typically use F. You may have to use cast and cast those to an actual Django range type to be able to do that. So there are a number of resources when it comes to working with ranges. So the PsychoPG2 extras documentation itself goes into some good detail about how you use those different classes and the functionality they provide. Obviously, the Django docs is a good place to start, and I've benefited a lot from looking at the tests as well. When it comes to understanding kind of any deeper thing in Django, or probably Python as a whole, looking at tests can be a huge benefit. This talk and the example project that I mentioned are on GitHub, and I encourage you to grab that, and there's very simple instructions for using it with Docker Compose to pull it up for yourself. And then a couple packages that I have worked on in the past that I've found very useful when it comes to working alongside ranges are the range merge package, and it just takes Postgres's range merge function for aggregates and allows you to do things like if you're filtering and you have one range way over here and one range here. So say from 1 to 2 and from 7 to 8. Range merge allows you to get from 1 to 8 returned, a single full range that covers the entirety of everything that's been filtered. And then Django generate series, very similar. It just helps you use Postgres' generate series to make sequences, which can be really helpful if you want to, for instance, have a denormalized database table of bucketed times or bucketed integer ranges. If you don't want to drop down to raw SQL, you can use that package to generate those. All right, and one final thought, because you got to leave this on a tacky last thing. A man works hard to name an interval equal to 24 hours, so he calls it a day.
So we do have a bunch of time if anyone would like to ask a range of questions. Well, actually, one per user.
You should have given the talk.
I did one yesterday.
Hi, Jack. Thank you. It's really good. I had a sort of half thought. Say I've got a model with 2 datetime fields and I haven't used a range. Can I query with a range object? Is that? Say that again. So I've got a model and I've got to start it out and I've finished that because I didn't think, oh, I know I'm going to use a range field. But, is there a sort of way I can query with a range object against that existing?
So you can, and I'm going to go back to towards the beginning when we were looking at the constraints. Oops. So this example from Django's docs actually about Postgres constraints. Here they use a TSTZ range to use that function within the Postgres database. And so you can use, very similar to what they do down at the bottom, or I guess it's kind of in the middle, is they have an expression there where they're using that function and then combining those two, period start and period end being the 2 distinct fields here. And then they're using range boundary. That just gives you the default inclusive, exclusive bounds. So that's generally how you would accomplish that.
Thanks for the talk. I have several models that have start and end dates that could have been ranges. What's the best strategy for converting a model to having a range instead of 2 fields?
Good question. I cheated. I was early enough in my project that I did what you're never supposed to do, and I deleted everything in the database and all the migrations and started over from scratch. You'd probably want to do a sequence of migrations where you add that field, populate it, again, doing something very similar here, right? Taking those 2 distinct fields and applying their value to the new field, and then eventually removing that field. There was a really good talk yesterday about migrations. I'd encourage you to watch that video after this, or whenever it comes up on the DjangoCon site, for some tips on how to make those sorts of changes. Well, thank you all very much. It was a pleasure speaking with you.